Hello, it's Adam from the Tudor Chest here. In addition to running the Tudor Chest, I'm also the co-director of Simply Tudor Tours, a historic tour company that I run alongside my colleague Sarah Morris, known to many of you as the Tudor Travel Guide, who is also today's podcast guest. Later this month, our July 2026 tour is launching and will be quite unlike any other tour that we are hosting. Titled 1502, The Year That Shook the Tudor Throne, on progress with Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, this tour will take us out of the traditional heartland of London and the South East into the stunning English Cotswolds and South Wales, visiting sites including Worcester Cathedral, Gloucester Cathedral, and featuring a 2-night stay at the breathtaking Thornbury Castle. To discover more on this and secure your place on one of our live tours, or to sign up to the latest updates, just head to simplytudortours.com. In 1502, the Tudor throne was rocked by a series of catastrophes which greatly troubled the security of King Henry VII's grip on power. To help quash further unrest, he and his queen, Elizabeth of York, embarked on a long progress through the southwest of England and into the southeast of Wales, taking in many of the major sites including the Palace of Woodstock, Berkeley Castle and Raglan Castle. Today, I am pleased to welcome my friend and business partner, Dr. Sarah Morris, onto the podcast for a discussion about this particular progress, as its theme is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the tours that we're running as part of our tour company, Simply Tudor Tours. Sarah will walk us through what our progress actually was, what impact it would have on the local area, what the significance of the places we are visiting were to Henry VII, plus much, much more. Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast, episode 58, 1502, The Year That Shook the Tudor Throne, with Dr. Sarah Morris. Welcome to the Tudor Chest podcast, Dr. Sarah Morris. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. What a week we've had, haven't we? Launching tours and still enjoying the vibe from the last one, I think.
A thought occurred to me this morning. I think I talked to you more than anyone else in my life.
Oh, well, apart from your dog.
Apart from my dog, you and Rex, I think, are the two people I speak, well, one person and animal that I speak to the most each day.
Well, on TV they have screen husbands, don't they, and screen wives. Well, we're going to be our sort of tour husband and tour wife, I think, is the way it's going to be.
Yeah, definitely. Partners in crime. We're here today to ultimately talk about the 1502 progress that Henry VII and Elizabeth of York took, and the fact that we're doing a tour from our tour company, Simply Tudor Tours, around that in 2026. Before we get into that, though, just a couple of get-to-know-you questions. Even though you've been on the podcast before, there might be some people who haven't listened to those episodes. So can you introduce yourself? Tell me a bit about your background and what you now do full-time.
Okay, so I'm Sarah, the Tudor Travel Guide online, and I've been doing the Tudor Travel Guide since 2018 now, and my focus is to tell the stories of Tudor history, places, and through the lens of the places in which those events took place. So that's my big thing. I love places and I love visiting them, and I love telling stories and sharing those stories with everyone, and that's what the Tudor Travel Guide is all about. It's not how I started life though, because I'm actually originally trained as a medic, but then actually I suppose you could say my main profession over the last 22 years has been as an executive coach and organizational development coach. But in the midst of all that, I started the Tudor Travel Guide as a hobby. Can you believe it? Which got a little bit out of control and has snowballed into, well, as you say, Adam, now we have co-founded together a little over a year ago, Simply Tudor Tours, which kind of seemed like a natural progression for both of us.
Absolutely.
loved writing and doing podcasts and doing social media reels about places that I go to and places much beloved in Tudor history. But what I really wanted to do was to meet people in the flesh and take them to these places and see and enjoy their delight, seeing some of them for the first time and remembering how wonderful that is.
It's such a lovely thing to do, isn't it? You know, people get so much out of it. I mean, the Rise and Fall of Anne Boleyn tour that we had at the start of September, it just went so well and everyone had the most wonderful time. And it's great, isn't it? So do you have what I think we could call a Tudor bugbear? Is there something that just really annoys you that is always sort of out there?
Yes, but it has a Tudor travel guide flavour to it, I think. And I don't know whether we've spoken about this before. We probably have. But it really is when people make up stories of, oh, Anne Boleyn was here. No, she wasn't. Bless, it's so easy for these legends to take root. And in fact, the 1502 Progress is actually another example of where somebody, and then they're going to remain nameless, wrote about the 1502 Progress as being solely undertaken by Elizabeth of York. And that has just gained traction. And many people believe that that is just the case. And that spawned all sorts of stories about how the marriage was falling apart and perhaps they were no longer getting on with each other. And in fact, meticulous research undertaken by particularly the folks who've been responsible for digitalizing the Queen's Chamber books, which really is the primary source of information for the 1502 Progress. It actually comprises of both the King's Chamber books and the Queen's Chamber books. And we can see that Henry was clearly on progress with her. So we can put that to bed, but it's so easy for these legends and myths to take root and then to snowball. And I've come across a few of those in relation to Henry was here or Anne was here when they absolutely weren't.
Are you going to burst my bubble and tell me the room at Thornbury that Henry and Anne supposedly slept in? Is that correct, or is that made up?
It's not made up, you'll be pleased to hear. And we have to have some supposition. We don't know that they were there. But what we do know when we're looking at places is the layout of the privy apartments. And we know that the King and Queen would always stay in the most high status apartments. And when you know where they are and you know the sequence of the rooms, you can take a pretty good guess that that's where they would have stayed. What I will say, though, is at Thornbury, like most great houses of the period, the King and Queen didn't share apartments. They had separate apartments. And in Thornbury, they were stacked. The Duchess was on the ground floor and the Duke on the first floor. And of course, that would have been taken over by Henry and Anne when they were on progress. So you have sort of mirrors of the chambers. So Anne, well, they may have slept together, but her bedroom is actually where the restaurant today is, which we will be dining in.
Lovely. So, as I said, what ultimately underpins today's conversation is the tour that we're doing, not till 2026, but bookings are going to be going live next week, which is called 1502, the year that shook the Tudor throne, on progress with Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. So it's probably worth starting by asking, what actually was a royal progress?
Yes, I think for those people who are coming new to Tudor history, it is important to make that clear. And people do ask me that question. So most of the time, the royal courts during the medieval and the Tudor period would be based in and around the great houses of London, the premier palaces, used at various different times, the likes of Greenwich and Whitehall and Hampton Court and Richmond and Eltham, for example. But usually once a year, and usually during the summer months, the court would pack up and head off on progress. This means that they moved out of the Thames Valley area and they would go on a circuit visiting a number of different locations. Some of those locations were property of the crown. Sometimes they were guests of various noble folk at court. And they would usually do a circuit that might last anywhere between 6 to 8 weeks, I think would be a standard type of progress that they would go on. Yeah. Sometimes a little longer. And there are a couple of key examples. And the ones I've studied most come from the early Tudor period. of Henry VIII, for example, the 1535 progress, they were away for 3.5 months having a jolly good
Wow.
time. So it was a chance to really, well, there were a number of reasons why the court went on progress. First of all, it was a chance for the main palaces in the Thames Valley to be cleaned and repaired because 1,000+ courtiers and then all the household servants living in one place for a period of time certainly left its mark, and things needed to be repaired, cleaned, and repainted. There was also the subject of disease that would often be rife in the city around London during the summer period. So it was a chance to escape to the fresher country air, escape the pestilence. So a healthy thing to do. It was also a chance to be seen by the populace in a time when there was no other way really of communicating, no social media, no TV, no radio. So people could see the monarch and see the might of the crown. And that was certainly important during a period of turbulence. And a good example of that would be Henry VII's progress to York in 1486, when he was really establishing himself as the founder of the new Tudor dynasty in an area of the country which had been so loyal to the House of York. And then finally, it was just a jolly good time away and a chance to get away from the pressure of court, to see different places, to hunt, to hawk, to be entertained, to schmooze. And in the case of actually this progress we're talking about, maybe we'll come on to that later, perhaps even raise some money from friends that you might want to sort of hobnob with and sucker up to.
It's just, a thought's just occurred to me. It's not a million miles away, I suppose, in some respects, to the fact that, the royal family now go up to Balmoral for, I think, about 2 months, in the summer. It's their way of getting away from it all and also seeing other people in that part of the country. So in a way, it's kind of, there's a sort of connection there that just popped into my head, I suppose.
I think you're right, actually. I hadn't really thought of it in that way, but it's like a scaled down version of the progress.
Yeah. Was I suppose the nature of the sovereign at the time, it was much more peripatetic than it is now, though, right? That need to be out and about. To your point, this was an age long before social media, photography. This was a way of showing off the might of the king, right?
Yeah, absolutely. During the medieval period and the Tudor period, the court was moving all the time. As I say, even when they were based in the Thames area, there was definitely a seasonality to the palaces that would be used. So they were almost like going on a mini progress throughout the year. So, for example, during the early Tudor reign, Greenwich was often used for Christmas time. Summers might be spent more towards Hampton Court. I think Easter tended to happen around Richmond, and Whitehall was often the base, once Henry took up Whitehall from Wolsey, was the base when Parliament was opening in the spring. So there was a general rhythm and sense to the annual movement of the court. And then you superimpose on top of this getting away. And there were different circuits. So it's perhaps interesting to mention that sometimes the court headed north. They may go, Grafton Regis was often on Henry VIII's itinerary as the most northerly place. That's up in Northamptonshire. That name might be familiar because it was originally the home of the Elizabeth Woodville. That's where Edward and Elizabeth married. Or another year they may head more down in sort of Kent, Sussex way. So clearly an agenda and itinerary was put together, and it varied from year to year. And some monarchs progressed more than others. And interestingly, bringing this back to the 1502 progress, what I really found interesting about Henry VII was he was extremely well travelled. We often talk about Elizabeth as being the monarch who had so many progresses, and obviously she had a long reign, but actually Henry got all over the place. So that was quite surprising to me.
I suppose the other advantage of things like this was that, it also gave them a chance to visit places maybe where there'd been some difficulties. I'm thinking, the northern progress that Henry VIII took with Catherine Howard following the Pilgrimage of Grace. That was because that was again another chance of stamping down and saying, this is, we're the royal family, we're in control, and so on. Would progresses have placed a heavy burden on the local area, sort of as and when the royal party arrived?
Yeah, massive, massive burden. I mean, although the court, the great houses, I should say, the great houses of the Tudor period, I've already mentioned that the likes of Richmond and Hampton Court could house around 1,000 people. Often when I don't think that included the household, the servants. That was basically the courtiers and their servants. But you've got to imagine that even though when the royal court went on progress, there was often a reduced number. It often wasn't the whole court that went on progress. And people did come and go as well. So, for example, we saw that in the 1535 progress. We had the Duke of Norfolk and the Duke of Suffolk and Thomas Cromwell popping in and going away and getting on with their own business back at their country estates, and then coming because sometimes they wanted to, sometimes they were summoned and came rather reluctantly. So there were people coming and going all the time. But you still nevertheless had a significant number of people on the move. And so the way that the court dealt with that is that they would send out folk called Knights Harbingers. These were people who went ahead of the progress to scope out things like accommodation and find suitable accommodation for everybody, because most of the places in which the royal couple would stay would not have enough accommodation to accommodate all of those travelling with the court. So they may pitch tents in the grounds, or they may find local houses and turf out the residents of those houses, pay them, of course, but nevertheless turf them out while these young courtiers moved in. I've
just got this vivid image in my head of like a message getting back to the nobles and them looking at each other like, oh, where are you? I'm in ye olde travel lodge. Where are you?
Something like that. Yeah. And you do see letters in the letters and papers of Henry VIII of saying, Cromwell I think it was the trip to Calais. I think it was Cromwell was talking about wanting lodgings close to the king. So obviously, and I think in Canterbury, where this is related to, they didn't stay in any grand palace there. I think they stayed in a private home. So there was very restricted space. And you've got Cromwell saying, I want to be close to the king. So, there was a kind of a prestige in that. But going back to your original question, there was pressure on accommodation. Of course, there was pressure on food supplies. And one of the interesting things about that for me that I learned when I started writing about progresses was these Knights Harbingers would go into the market and they would set the prices, because, of course, if you suddenly have an influx of several hundred people, supply and demand says that the prices would rocket. And so,
especially if a large percentage of those people are wealthy as well.
Yeah, we can afford to charge. So they would actually, and I think this is a bit unfair really, but they'd go in and they'd set the prices so there was a maximum price that could be paid during the duration of the visit. So a big burden on the local area. And then, of course, you have the burden if they were visiting somebody. And that, Elizabeth I was renowned for that, wasn't she? Selecting to stay with people she actually didn't like as well as liked, just to impose a huge financial burden, because it was the responsibility of the host to pay for the entirety of the stay. And one little anecdote I came upon during writing about the 1535 progress was William Paulet, who became the Marquis of Winchester. Henry and Anne went to stay with him at his shiny new house of Basing House in Hampshire. And it no longer exists, but there used to be a diary of his, and he put in the margin something like it had cost him like £1 million or some huge amount of money for a 4-day stay, and kind of bemoaning that how he was ever going to make this back. So, big financial burden.
So we start the tour by visiting the site of the old Palace of Woodstock. It's now home to the behemoth Blenheim Palace. So can you tell me a bit about the Palace of Woodstock? What ties did it have to the Tudors, who owned it when the royal party visited, and so on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I should say that the 1502 progress actually starts in London, but what we're going to focus on, we'd be away for weeks if we tried to do this. We're focusing on a loop that they did, which took them from Woodstock in Oxfordshire down to the southeast of Wales and Monmouthshire, and then back up to end our loop at Woodstock. So it seemed a very convenient part of the progress to follow in some detail. And Woodstock, alongside those great houses that I mentioned, Hampton Court, Whitehall, etc., was the only, it was huge, it was very unusual in that it was the only great house that was outside that Thames Valley area. It was capable of housing around 1,000 people, and it was therefore enormous. It had originally been a Saxon palace, and then when William the Conqueror came along and the early medieval kings, particularly Henry I and Henry II, they fell in love with the area, notably because I think there was something like 500 square miles of hunting to be had in 5 forests that all converged around the palace. And of course, we know how beloved hunting was as a sport of nobility through the medieval and the Tudor period. So, yes, so it was much used, much loved throughout the medieval period. And then interestingly, when Henry comes to the throne, he actually continues the love affair with Woodstock, and he puts a huge amount of money. I think Simon Thurley had noted that he spent around £4,000 basically doing renovations and repairs. He built the main gatehouse and very firmly put across the top of the gatehouse, basically something that said like Henry VII builded these halls. And later visitors in the 1600s noticed that there was Tudor iconography everywhere, Tudor roses, both portcullises, dragons, all over the place. So Henry clearly had a great affection for Woodstock. He visited on several occasions. And he put a lot of money into it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a large amount of money for a man who was known for being so parsimonious.
A huge amount of money. But it was an enormous palace. I mean, I would love to see it because it's gone now, I should say, for those people who are going, where can I visit? We are going to visit on the tour the site of the palace. And that's going to be right at the beginning when we set the scene for the progress, because what we're perhaps not mentioning here, but maybe I should just say, was how important the title of this tour is, The Year That Shook the Tudor Throne. Because after Henry came to the throne in 1486, there were 2 pretenders of the House of York tried to unseat him. He quashed those. By the turn of the century, 1500s, things were looking stable. And then suddenly he starts to have these series of losses, personal losses. They lose little Edmund, their youngest son, at 16 months old. Then people like John Morton, who was his Archbishop of Canterbury and his Lord Chancellor, and who'd been a real stalwart support for Henry, died just a couple of months later. And then, of course, although we have this celebration of the marriage of the Prince of Wales, Prince Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon in November 1501, by April 1502, the year of this progress, of course, Arthur dies tragically and suddenly at Ludlow. So the backdrop for this progress is that the couple are in a state of grief and probably shock and a huge degree of uncertainty that they'd hoped that they'd put behind them. And in fact, this is why this progress is so interesting, because it's not the usual state progress full of pomp and ceremony, going to great cities and being received with all sorts of, pomp and celebration. No, this is much more about grief and healing. And almost as Sam Harper, who is one of the team who digitalized the Queen's Chamber book, says, almost like a trip down memory lane, because they're heading for Raglan, where Henry spent some years as a boy. I'm sure we'll come on to that. So I just wanted to say that because I think it is important. And so we start at Woodstock. It's a place that Henry knows well. It's a huge, monumental palace, great gatehouse, huge courtyard. And in fact, it's here's a little bit of Tudor trivia for you. It's one of the only palaces I've come across where there is a great hall on both the king and the queen's sides.
Hmm.
which is really unusual. You usually have one great hall, and then from the high end of the great hall, the royal apartments split. You go through to the royal apartments from the high end, and then it splits into king's and queen's sides. So, and it had 6 chapels, tennis courts, gardens. I mean, it was enormous,
It had six
and
chapels.
6
That's
chapels,
wild.
6, including a
Mm.
round chapel, which again is really unusual. There's one at Ludlow Castle. If people have been to Ludlow, it's thought to have been similar to that. And one of the reasons I think Woodstock is particularly interesting to me is that there were a couple of visitors in the 1600s. One of them is rather enigmatically called the Lieutenant, who basically takes a stroll through the palace and writes it all down. He writes down what he sees. Thank you, God. For people like me, that is just
Yeah, that's gold dust for you.
gold dust for me, and that's why we're able to know exactly what happened. How Woodstock looked, because sadly, I think it was in the 1700s when the new Duke of Marlborough was created. His Duchess Sarah, first Duchess of Marlborough, they wanted to build Blenheim Palace on the other side of what would become the lake at Blenheim, and Sarah didn't like the view of Woodstock Palace, which by then was in ruins, and so she just had the whole thing torn down.
Is that the same Sarah played by Rachel Weisz in The Favourite?
I think so. It's a period of history I've no interest in, but I think
it must
it is.
be. I'm fairly certain it is.
I think it is.
So after the Old Palace of Woodstock site, we're moving on to Worcester and Gloucester and visiting both of those cities' respective cathedrals. So can you walk me through sort of the notable things that happened at both of these places, and what are some of the sort of the Tudor treasures that are held there?
Yeah. And Worcester, I would say, it's not on the 1502 progress, but we are visiting it on our first full day of the tour. And I think that's important because it speaks to this point of the context for the progress itself, i.e. the year 1502, the year that Arthur died, because many people will know listening to this, after his death at Ludlow, Arthur's body was brought to Worcester Cathedral and buried there close to the high altar. And over the subsequent 20 or so years, a fabulous chantry chapel was built around his tomb chest, and that still survives today. And I do think as I said before, I think to get a tone of the progress and to understand how poignant it was for the royal couple, because I should say, and I forgot to say, that by the time the party arrived at Woodstock, Elizabeth was already 3 months pregnant. She got pregnant almost immediately after Arthur died. Most people believe it was in the May, so just a month later. So it's extraordinary, actually, that she decided to go on progress, because she was 36, so she wasn't a young mother. She was actually ill at Woodstock. We don't know why. One of her ladies in waiting was also ill, so they may have caught some kind of infectious disease. Or she may have had some problems with her pregnancy, because when we return to Woodstock, she's ill again. But so I just raised that because there's all sorts going on for them personally. There must have been a lot of stress and strain. And I think it is really useful to go to Worcester and to go and talk about all of those events in some detail, about the significance of Arthur, the significance of his death, the strain that put on the crown to produce a spare, which essentially is what Elizabeth was attempting to do. And we can go and do that by standing right in the place where Arthur is buried, and it is a beautiful chantry chapel. So that's the highlight of going to Worcester. There's another interesting Tudor tomb there. A Welshman who actually was at the head of Arthur's funeral procession. He's buried in a tomb chest there. And then we're also going to have I couldn't resist it because I've done it before, and I really wanted to take people up to the medieval library. It's not something you can normally do. It's not open to the public generally, but I have been up there, and the cathedral, as you imagine, it's the original medieval library. Or could it be the dormitory? I can't remember, but it's part of the original medieval abbey. And the archivists there are just wonderful. And they've got all sorts of Tudor books and documents that they're going to bring out for us. So whilst that's not related directly to the 1502 progress, I think the chance for people to actually touch and see right up close Tudor manuscripts and books, I think is a special thing. So I just, really wanted to give people that opportunity. So we will be going there.
Amazing. I'm so excited.
So that's
And how about Gloucester?
Gloucester, yeah. Well, apart from being in my top 3 cathedrals, Gloucester was on the 1502 progress. We're not going to every place on the 1502 progress, by the way. That would just take too long. But they were progressing down from Woodstock, passing through places like Northleach and Cobberley and Prinash Abbey, which is very close to Gloucester. It used to be the country lodge for the abbots of Gloucester, and it's still there today, and it happens to still be a little monastery, which is really cool. But I'll come back to the significance of Prinash in a moment, because it does relate directly to Gloucester. After Prinash, they stay at a place called Over, which is just on the other side of Gloucester. And looking at the routes that they could have taken, it's almost certain to me that they would have travelled through the middle of the medieval city. Henry had visited at least a couple of occasions before. He had a very close relationship with a chap called Henry Dean, who was the prior of one of the monasteries in Gloucester called Lantony Priory. And Henry Dean actually officiated at the marriage of Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur, and would end up being an Archbishop of Canterbury under Henry VII. So I believe that they would have gone through Gloucester, and almost certainly if you go through the middle of Gloucester, you will see the cathedral is right there. And I think they probably visited the cathedral, and in the usual state of affairs would have been greeted and said mass at the high altar and greeted with a Te Deum. And so they were at Gloucester, and since we're traveling there, and the cathedral is so amazing architecturally and has the most astounding cloisters in the world, part of the Harry Potter. If anybody's seen Harry Potter, they will recognise Gloucester cloisters when they go. But in the cloisters, there's actually a set of stained glass windows, and those stained glass windows came from Prinash Abbey, and they have the coats of arms of the likes of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and a number of other Tudor royals, actually. And they're so easily missed. If you don't know they're there, you would just walk past them and you probably wouldn't even notice. And those are little hidden gems that I really love finding. I was really thrilled to find them and really thrilled to see them. And I can't wait to show them to people.
And those cloisters are beautiful. They're really gorgeous. And yeah, they're used in the 6th film, Half-Blood Prince, I think.
We have a Harry Potter fan amongst us.
Yeah, big Harry Potter fan. So we're also at that point, we're going to be meeting Sean Cunningham to discuss the life of Arthur Tudor in more detail. Can you tell me a bit about Sean and what we're going to be hearing from him?
Yeah, I mean, Sean has written a biography of Arthur Tudor, so we're absolutely delighted that he's going to be joining us. He works down at the National Archives at Kew. He's written Arthur's biography. We're going to be meeting him. We're actually going to meet him on site at Worcester. Obviously, that makes the most sense to meet him where Arthur is buried. And again, I think Sean is just going to be important in filling in some of those details about Prince Arthur's life and why he was so important to the Tudor dynasty and what died when he died. So I've not met Sean before, so I'm really looking forward to seeing him.
So on day 3, we're heading over to Berkeley Castle and Beverston Castle. So what is the significance of these particular locations for the Tudors and as part of the itinerary of the progress?
They were, of course, on the 1502 progress, both of those locations, but they're very different, though. I mean, they're similar in that they're both castles, but they're very different in terms of how well known they are. So again, I get a little bit of a thrill here because while Berkeley Castle is a well-established sort of visitor attraction, Beverston Castle was a discovery for me. I was beside, as I am, when I find out that a location actually still exists, and I didn't know it still exists, even if it's in a fairly ruinous state, I get incredibly overexcited. And Beverston is one of those places. It was in its day one of the most important castles alongside Gloucester and Berkeley, important castles in Gloucestershire, with a very noble history. But it has since fallen into ruin, and only part of the castle is today survived. It survives as a private residence, but the privy chambers, the part of the castle, the medieval part of the castle that Henry and Elizabeth would have stayed in, still survives in substantial ruins. And I got the chance, was it this summer? Yeah, this summer, to get inside those ruins, because they're normally locked. I mean, it's a private residence, so normally you can't get anywhere near the place. But on our tour, we've been invited along to go and see the castle up close and take tea and cake on the terrace right next to where the Great Tower is, which is part, as I say, of the royal lodgings. It's a beautiful chapel inside. So yes, they didn't stay. It was one of those locations. They didn't stay very long, but it's interesting because it's so off the beaten track. And I think that's one of the things that we're looking forward to with this tour.
Yeah.
Is getting people out of London, right?
Yeah. And also taking them to places that they aren't particularly not, au fait with. I mean, on the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn, I think a real happy surprise for a lot of people was Penshurst Place, because they'd never been to it. It'd never really been on their radar. And they, for a lot of the tour participants, it was a real highlight of the experience, seeing somewhere that they just wouldn't have ever considered going to.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a stop off at Beverston, and it should be charming and quintessentially English, I hope. I hope the weather behaves itself, because it's one of those places where if you're having tea and cake on the terrace, you really want it to behave itself. And then it'll be Berkeley, which is, it's a mighty castle, founded in the early medieval period, developed over sort of 200-300 years. The footprint of the castle is still as pretty much it would have been when it was essentially completed. And that is one of the things that I like specifically about Berkeley, is it's got a lovely flow from the Great Hall up the stairs to the first floor and into what would have been the beginning of the privy range that would have been used by visiting royalty like Henry and Elizabeth. And then later, of course, we know Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn stayed there for a week. In fact, they both stayed there for a week. So Elizabeth and Henry stayed in Berkeley. It was owned by the Crown at the time, which is an interesting story in itself. It's of 900 years of history, there are only 60 years where it wasn't in the ownership of the Lords of Berkeley Castle. And that 60 years spans sort of Henry VII's reign right to the end of Edward VI. And that all happened on the back of a negotiation when Lord Berkeley, who fell out with his family and his heir, didn't want them to inherit the castle. So he went to Henry VII and said, "You can have my castle when I die, as long as you make me a marquis, and you make me the Earl Marsh of England for the duration of my lifetime." And Henry accepted that. And so that's exactly what happened. So when Henry and Elizabeth visited, it was their house, and it remained with the Crown until the death of Edward, because there were no subsequent male heirs, and that was all part of the pact that had been made between the Berkeleys and the Crown. So it then, under Mary I, reverted to the Lords of Berkeley Castle.
I see. Who knew? That's complete news to me. And Berkeley is, of course, famous as the site of one of the most notorious royal deaths, or I suppose potentially notorious royal deaths in history. Would you like to discuss that one?
Yeah, I mean, I can touch on it. I'm not particularly an early medievalist, and I say this with caution, because whenever I post about this on Instagram, I get a shed load of comments.
It didn't happen.
It didn't happen. It didn't happen like that. Yeah, so I say this with a great deal of caution. But one of the legends goes that it was Edward II fell foul of his court and nobles, and eventually was basically apprehended, arrested, and removed from his position as King of England and imprisoned. And he eventually found his way to Berkeley Castle. And there is, it is said, the cell where the king was held still at Berkeley today. You can look at it, look through a window at it. And then at some point while he was there, so legend goes, he died. But he died under rather horrific circumstances. Those of you who know the story will know that there was a red hot poker involved. Going into, I think they called it at the time his fundament, I think was the the description. Not surprisingly, because of course, why? Because they wanted to kill him in a way that there would be no marks seen upon his body, essentially. The other story is that he was never murdered and that he escaped and fled to the continent. Either way, a fantastic tomb. In fact, one of the most beautiful royal tombs, I think, can be seen at Gloucester Abbey. So we'll see it when we go to Gloucester. It's not part of the 1502 progress, but it is worth looking at because it's a beautiful memorial. And the way it's positioned, quite often when you go, the sun is illuminating it in shafts of light, and it makes for a great photo opportunity, I have to tell you. Anyway, so that's the legend of poor old King Edward II. Yeah.
The poker up the bum. Probably didn't happen, but it's a bloody good story. So, I mean, I think the jewel in the crown of the tour is absolutely going to be the 2-night stay that we're having at the gorgeous Thornbury Castle. Thornbury has a long and a rich history. It's, notable as it was one of the key properties that was owned by the Dukes of Buckingham. But what's the link to King Henry VII?
So you're quite right. Beautiful. It's on the top of a lot of Tudor lovers' itinerary, the wish to stay at the luxurious and much feted Thornbury Castle, which of course today is a 5-star hotel. So the link with Henry, let's start with the link with the 1502 progress first of all, and then I'll touch on the other link there. The progress went very close to Thornbury, and in fact, when you look at the Queen's Chamber books, there is an entry that said the Queen made an offering at the church. The church is actually located right next to Thornbury Castle. It would be tempting to think that Elizabeth went there herself, but when you actually look at the itinerary and plot it out, it's clear that actually it would have been a major diversion just to go and make an offering. And it's clear that they didn't stay at Thornbury. You can see by the dates, the Queen's Chamber book's basically a record of her Receiver General. This is the guy who basically is making payments on behalf of the Queen. And it's quite clear that on one day she's here and on the next day she's somewhere else. And there's a mention in the middle that she goes to that there's this offering at Thornbury. And you actually see Elizabeth doing this throughout the progress. She makes offerings all the way through the progress at local shrines and churches. And the offerings are all about, of course, the safe delivery of a son and heir. But she didn't always make those in person. Sometimes she seems to have, but other times she would have sent somebody just to make the offering on her behalf. So that's where Thornbury is mentioned. I don't think they stayed there. However, of course, we do know that Thornbury became the home of Jasper Tudor, Henry VII's much beloved uncle who supported him through thick and thin. When Jasper married, I think it was Catherine Woodville, sister to Elizabeth Woodville, who had been, of course, the Duchess of Buckingham before her own husband had been executed. I think it was by Richard III for a failed plot against him, an uprising against the House of York. She obviously was a widow. Jasper comes along. He marries her. And I presume because the Buckinghams at that time owned Thornbury Castle, there was probably no heir. I'm not quite sure about the mechanism of how it happened, but I imagine that's why Jasper and Catherine end up being at Thornbury. And of course, Jasper Tudor dies there in 1495. So, it definitely does have links to Henry VII. And we wanted to just enjoy those links, but also make the most of staying in, probably after Hever, the most wanted place on people's list of Tudor places to stay.
It is remarkable. The rooms there are just so beautiful. When did it shift from being a sort of private residence, a castle, owned by a family, into being a hotel? When did that happen?
So from what I can make out, I mean, it's interesting because, as you mentioned, Thornbury's got a really long history. I mean, it was a Saxon palace. So that's pre-Norman invasion of 1066. And from what I can make out, it has royal ownership, first of all. It's granted to Matilda, who's the wife of William the Conqueror. And then it's owned by the De Clares. And then it comes into the Stafford family ownership, the Dukes of Buckingham. Yeah. And then through marriage, a Howard. I don't know if I'm sure there'll be a link somewhere to the Howards, but I don't know what that link is. And then that carries on right the way through. I think they own it for about 300 years, from the 1600s through to 1966, when I think there was the first attempt to create some kind of restaurant there with a few select bedrooms. And then from that point forward, it's had a numerous kind of owners, and it seems to have evolved as a hotel. And I think the last change of ownership, I think was it 2018, 2019? Looking at I've been to Thornbury 3 or 4 times. I've had afternoon tea there on a couple of occasions. I've mooched around the grounds and the gardens, but I've never actually stayed there. But the pictures look amazing, I have to say.
I know, I'm tempted to put my hand in my own pocket for one of the suites. I mean, I was looking at the photographs of it last night, actually, and I think it's the Catherine of Aragon suite. The bed is so big that it has 4 lots of pillows.
Really?
Like, it's that wide. Yeah, it's got 4 sets of standard pillows, which is, wild.
Brilliant.
So I can't wait for that. I think that's going to be brilliant. The next stop, we're going over to Raglan Castle, where we're also going to be meeting with Nathan Amin, and also Monmouth. Again, these are locations I'm not massively aware of. So can you tell me a bit about the history of these places and what role they played in the progress?
Yeah. So I love Raglan Castle. It's got an amazing history. There was a medieval castle there, but you get to the mid 15th century and you have this Welshman from a minor gentry family called William ap Thomas who takes the place on. But it's actually his son who eventually becomes Sir William Herbert, who really becomes powerful, influential and wealthy, and is largely responsible for the Raglan Castle we see today. And he does that because he gets on the side of the House of York and he fights alongside the future Edward IV at battles like Mortimer's Cross and Towton. And as a result of his loyalty and his bravery, Edward, once he is crowned, heaps honours upon him and a lot of money, and he becomes Edward's master lock, which basically meant that the crown relied upon him to keep law and order in most of Wales, actually. And it was, in fact, it wasn't just his local area. During the Wars of the Roses, when Edward IV was established on the throne, there was still some areas of Lancastrian resistance at Harlech and Pembroke. And it was Sir Walter Herbert, because there is a Walter Herbert coming up. I'm always getting my Walters and my Williams mixed up. It was Sir William Herbert who became the first Earl of Pembroke, who laid siege to both of those castles. And of course, Pembroke is important because in that castle was Jasper Tudor and little Henry Tudor, who was 4 at the time, something like that.
Yes, where he was born, wasn't it?
Yes, it was where he was born. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So he was just a little toddler. Eventually, Pembroke falls and Jasper fleds abroad, and basically Henry Tudor is taken by Sir William to become his ward. He pays a large amount of money to the crown and he becomes the ward of Sir William, and he is ensconced in Raglan Castle, which by now is a castle fortress. It's strategically placed next to a very important road between Aberfageni and Monmouth. It's the administrative centre for this kind of the Marcher lordship of the whole area. And little Henry is brought up in the schoolroom alongside Sir William's two sons, another William and Walter. And at least one of those, Walter Herbert, becomes a lifelong friend of little Henry Tudor, who is there for around 7 years-ish, 7 or 8 years. And eventually he is released from that wardship when the first Earl of Pembroke, Sir William Senior, is executed following the Battle of Edgecote when the Yorkists are defeated. But by this time, he's obviously created 7 or 8 years of memories. He's created a strong brotherly bond, at least with Sir Walter. We don't know so much about Sir William. But Sir Walter would go on and fight for Henry at Bosworth. And in fact, following Henry's victory, and I found out this from Sam Harper, who I mentioned earlier, he would send Henry Tudor a present, a gift, every year on the anniversary of the Battle of Bosworth. And so the relationship to this tour is that this is this personal sense of grief and healing, of a trip down memory lane. They go to Raglan, they go to this place that Henry knew as a child. Their host is Sir Walter. He's still alive. And he hosts their week-long stay there. And you really get the sense that it is a personal affair. And so Raglan is like the apex. It's the centerpiece, if you like. It's where they were aiming to get to on the 1502 progress. So it's really important from that point of view. And then purely architecturally, it's really interesting because it's a late medieval, early Tudor castle, which is unusual. Most castles were built, as you know, Adam, sort of much earlier on in the medieval period.
1200s, 1300s.
That's right. This is really built from the mid-1450s, and it's still being added to and aggrandized into the Elizabethan period. It's a palace fortress, and it's got all the mod cons that you would hope to see in in a castle, but with this sense of it being a luxurious family home. And although it's in ruins, it's substantial ruins. So you can still get a sense of all the different areas in the castle.
Whilst we're in Monmouth, we're due to see a very notable artefact, the Monmouth chasuble, which is an amazing survivor, really, from the 15th century. What can you tell me about this item? What actually is it?
Oh, I'm so excited to find this. I can't say I discovered it. I'm not claiming to have discovered it, but a lot of reading and digging, I came across a paper or a book that had been written by a fairly local historian who had become obsessed with a place in Monmouth called Mitchell Troy, they actually stayed in Monmouth at a house called Mitchell Troy, just outside the town. And apart from giving me loads of information about Mitchell Troy, in there, suddenly I find that there were some medieval church vestments which have been said to have been donated by Elizabeth of York to the local town, to Monmouth, during their stay at Mitchell Troy. And I was just so excited, gobsmacked to know that these artifacts directly relating to the 1502 progress, to Henry and Elizabeth, and I'll tell you why we can be pretty sure about that just in a moment, still survive. They still survive, and they're in local churches. And one in particular that we are going to see is, now for those people who don't know what a chasuble, or I call it a chasuble, is, it's basically a church vestment. It's like a tabard. It's like you put it over your head, and it's like a tabard front and back. And it is, and there's also a kind of a stole. Would you call it a stole? A kind of just like almost not a scarf, but you wear it round your neck and it just drapes down either side. So that's also with it. I was amazed. And so I managed to go and track it down, and I managed to go and get to see it. And I turn up at this church, because this is never on view, this thing. So we're very privileged, really privileged to get to see it. And And they put it in the center of the nave on display for me, and could get right up to it and touch it. And this is just exquisite sort of English needlework and embroidery. And down at the bottom in the corner, there's a little rebus, and a rebus is like a play on words, and the Tudors loved them. And it was the rebus of John Morton, who I mentioned earlier, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who died in 1500, the end of 1500. And it's a little barrel, so the ton, Morton, and there's an MR, Morton. So we know it belonged to him, and yet it's in Wales. He had no connection with the area. So the belief is that it was with the royal party, and it was one of these offerings that Elizabeth gave to the priory, the monastery, the priory in Monmouth, while she was staying at nearby Mitchell-Troy. And amazingly, it was shielded from Protestants and hidden away and kept safe, and has survived. And it's an incredible state of preservation.
I was going to say, it's in really, really good nick, isn't it?
It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. And even Illyria Lynn, who is going to join us to see this, because Illyria Lynn was the ex-curator of historic clothing at historic royal palaces, and she was the lady who found the Bacton altar cloth. So what Illyria doesn't know about Tudor textiles and clothing, it's not worth knowing. And when I emailed her, after I'd been to see it, she'd never heard of it before. So wow. She was so excited, because she's Welsh also. So she's going to be joining us to tell us what we're looking at.
Yeah.
Because although it's a beautiful thing, it's much more interesting, of course, when you're with somebody who knows what they're talking about and can really tell us exactly what we're looking at, and what was the nature of the textiles and how were they used, and what can we actually see in the embroidery and the stitching, and what kind of workmanship was required. And just that I think will really bring it to life.
Again, so excited to see it, because these sorts of things, they're so rare to survive, and to survive in such a good state of preservation is even rarer. So again, I can't wait to see it. So we wrap up the tour in Cirencester. We're going to Cirencester Church and Fairford Church. Again, sites I'm not particularly au fait with. So what are the significance of these places, and what can people on the tour expect to learn whilst we're there?
So I'll talk about them together, really, because I want to talk about their importance as Cotswold wool churches. And this is another element that I learned a lot about when researching and writing up this progress. I knew the Cotswolds. Cotswolds is an area of outstanding natural beauty in the UK. It's people travel from all over the world because it is beautiful. And it is known for its wool, and it certainly was known for its wool in the medieval and Tudor period. In fact, what I learned, which I didn't appreciate, is that it was absolutely the epicenter of the wool trade in the whole of Europe. And in fact, one of the towns that we're not visiting actually on this progress, but it's close, it's all part North Leach, was the epicenter of the whole of the trade, of the wool trade. And Cirencester and Fairford were the other two big important centres. And in each of them, you have what are called these wool churches. These basically are churches that were built on the profits of the wool trade by the wealthy wool merchants of the town. And they are often extraordinarily large, given the size of the town. So Fairford, you get the sense in Fairford, it's like, wow, that's quite substantial church. It's like, it's bigger than it should be. And that's because there was so much money that was poured into them. And the reason, basically, on the 1502 progress, as Henry and Elizabeth are making their way back north through the Cotswolds, they stay at a place called Coates Place, which has essentially now gone, just outside of Cirencester. And then they pass through Cirencester. They would have had to pass through. No other route would have taken them to the final destination, which was Fairford. And I believe, and this is a little bit of sort of projection and guesswork on my part, but there are a few things that come together. Henry schmoozed the wool merchants of the Cotswolds on a regular basis, and he relied upon them for funding for the crown. So the crown was really dependent on loans from wealthy merchants, wool merchants in particular. So Henry had to develop good relationships with them. And we know that there was one family in particular based in Fairford called Tame family, who were extremely wealthy and did very good business with the crown. I mean, generated huge amounts of money. And so it's not surprising that we see Henry and Elizabeth making a week-long stop, I think it was 5 days a week, at Fairford, where the Thames had a lovely manor house that they'd built right next to the church. They'd also rebuilt the church. And then finally, around 1500, they started to install a set of stained glass windows. And that's the real treasure that people are going to see. We'll see some treasures in Cirencester Church as well that are directly linked to Henry VII and the Tudors. But for the sake of not going on too long, I'll hone in on just on Fairford and say that the set of windows, I think there's like 28, 29 sets of stained glass windows. There's only one or two later Victorian replacements of part of the glass, but these are the most extensive surviving Tudor glasswork in the country. I think it's been, wow. They were believed to have been created by Bernard Flower, who was Henry VII's chief glazier. And they're astonishing survivors, utterly astonishing. And funnily enough, interestingly, and this is a little bit of something to play with, there's thought to be in amongst the glass faces of people of the Tudor court, like Wolsey, for example. And it's kind of fun to go around and see if you can guess and find out. And Elizabeth of York is said to be there as well. There's a little bit of legend around that, I don't know. But we do know that when they were complete around 1520, just to finish the story, Henry VIII came hot-footed it, in fact, from the Field of Cloth of Gold up to Fairford, just to Fairford and back again. He didn't go on wider progress, and it's a really mysterious thing. But Sam Harper, who I've talked extensively to about this progress, wonders whether he was with Elizabeth of York and Henry on that progress when he was Prince of Wales, because his Prince of Wales feathers are in the stained glass windows, and whether when they were completed, he was invited back by the Thames to come and see these windows. Or perhaps he just wanted to get some money off them, having spent a shed load of cash at the Field of Cloth of Gold.
Or maybe he was just curious to see them, especially if maybe figures of his court and his parents were sort of hidden amongst the stained glass.
Yeah, maybe.
That could be, yeah. Well, how exciting. Again, can't wait to see it. So I know this is probably going to be a torturous question for you to answer, but of the places we're visiting, which of them would you love to have seen in all of its Tudor splendour the most?
Everybody reads about Woodstock, and I think it's just great to go and stand there. There's a plinth which marks its original position, and we can talk about the progress. We can talk about the palace and what happened there. And so to answer your question, it has to be Woodstock, because Woodstock was one of those great houses, and the architecture sounds fascinating to me, and I love going there and seeing it how it is now, because they flooded the valley with it, and now there's a lake there, but it didn't used to be there. So I love going there and just imagining this fabulous palace. And so I would love to have wandered around Woodstock without a doubt.
I thought that's what you'll say, and it would be the same for me, because also it would be lovely, because the history of Woodstock is really old. I mean, as you say, it goes back to the time of William the Conqueror and Henry I. So to see a space that they inhabited and that they were aware of would just be wonderful, because again, alas, there are so much that is now lost. So final question, what aspect of the tour are you most excited about for people to see and experience?
I think I'm going to talk quite a sort of a meta, what I call a meta level, top level, which is basically what I mean by that is that it's just taking people to places that are totally off the normal tourist routes. I think, we do tours, of course, and we love doing those tours to the big places, the Hampton Courts, the Westminster Abbeys. We love doing that. But we know that for people who've done all of those things, they want to explore places that they've never been to before, maybe even never heard of before, and to be able to see they've seen things that very few Tudor lovers. I mean, how many Tudor lovers have seen that Monmouth chasuble? Not many. And so I'm so excited about getting people out into the Cotswolds, beautiful part of the world, but getting people well off the Tudor trail and to enjoy the typical Tudor trail and to just enjoy seeing places that they would never think to get to, or perhaps even, and I've had this comment before from people saying, I've really loved being here, but I wouldn't have known how to get here on my own. So, being able to take people, that's going to be great.
And then that's, again, that's the thing I'm most excited about, because also for me as well, I mean, I'm trying to think, but I'm fairly certain I've not been to anywhere on this tour before. Yeah, I don't think I have. So I'm actually incredibly excited as well, because all of these places are going to be new to me. So I just cannot wait. Ooh. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on and having a chat about the 1502 progress and adding a lot of depth to the places that we're going to be visiting. So thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you, Sarah, if they don't already know where to find you, that is?
Yeah, so the Tudor Travel Guide is www.thetudortravelguide.com. I'm also on Instagram as the Tudor Travel Guide, and I do have a podcast called the Tudor History and Travel Show that you can find in most major platforms.
Okay, well, thank you again for coming on for a chat, and you and I speak 54 times a day, I think, on average, so we'll speak again soon.
Very, very soon, I'm sure.
Yes.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Adam.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess podcast. My thanks to Sarah for coming onto the show for a discussion with me all about the 1502 progress. In addition to this, my main episode, I also release a weekly subscriber-only episode. From just £5 a month, you can access all content from the Tudor Chest. To access this, just head to patreon.com/The Tudor Chest or search for the podcast in Apple Podcasts, where you can also subscribe. If you have any questions or suggestions for future podcast episodes, please do reach out to me via Instagram. I would love to hear from you. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and speak soon.